So, this is really loose.
Welcome to the video where I changed the rear differential pinion bearing seal on my 1990 Ford Bronco four-wheel drive that is equipped with an 8.8 rear differential. This will be the same process for 1983 through 1996 Bronco, 1983 through 2012 F-150, as well as a whole bunch of other vehicles that are equipped with that 8.8 rear differential. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to jack up the back of the vehicle and you're going to put the axle on jack stands. Then you're going to slide underneath and you're going to remove the rear driveshaft, and that's held on by 4 bolts in the front and 4 bolts in the back, and you'll use a 12.10 millimeter socket to remove those. Now you'll use an 1 1/16 socket to remove the pinion nut. Now that pinion nut is on there very hard, so you will need to break it loose using a breaker bar. Then once it's loose, you can use a socket if it's quicker. The socket will turn a little bit hard all the way off because it does have Loctite on it from the factory. Once you've removed the nut, you can remove the companion flange. As you can see, mine just slid right off. I have heard people say that they needed to use a puller, but I did not need to use a puller. Then you'll use either a very dull screwdriver or a dull chisel to put in the space between the pinion seal and the casting of the differential, and you'll tap it in with a hammer and you'll work around in a circle. And it's okay if you damage this seal, but the reason why we're using a dull chisel is so it doesn't damage the casting. You can see on the lower part of the casting that it looks like it's all scarred up, but that actually just scraped the rust off and it's still very smooth. So here I'm holding the bearing in hard and moving the pinion, and I can see that the pinion seems relatively solid in there. So you saw me take off the thrust washer, and now I'm using my knife to pull out the outer pinion bearing only. Here I'm taking a very close look at this pinion bearing to make sure there isn't any damage, worn spots, cracks, or anything like that. The bearing itself looks very good, and here you can see I'm pulling out the crush bushing. The only reason why I'm pulling that out is because I want to clean it before I put it back in. That crush bushing is used for setting the distance between the pinion gear and the ring gear when you're putting in a brand new set of gears. Now that I've cleaned out the bearings and the thrust washer and the crush bushing, I put them back in place and then set a new seal in place, and I just start them by tapping on them very lightly with a hammer. Then I'll use a steel ring and tap around the outside to make sure it goes in evenly, and once it's all the way seated, you will hear the different tone of the hammer when it hits. There I was checking the gap to make sure it was pushed all the way in with my pocket knife, and now you can see me lubing up that seal. You never want to put a seal in and install it completely dry. You always want to lube it up as best as possible. I'm also putting a little bit of lube on the OD of that flange shaft, and then I line up the splines and put on the flange. Only push the flange on as far as you can by hand, and then install the nut. Use the nut to push the flange on as far as it needs to go. Make sure you put some Loctite on the nut so it doesn't come off during your use. So before tightening this nut up all the way, you will have to drop the vehicle down onto its rear tires so you can actually tighten this up. You need to tighten it up to an excessive 160 foot-pounds of torque minimum, so you're going to need all the help you can get on that. Once the pinion nut is installed, you'll need to use a 3/8 extension and ratchet to loosen up the filler plug. The filler plug has a square, 3/4 inch square notch in it. So I loosen it up, and then I'm using some brake cleaner to clean off all the grunge and grime around it so it doesn't fall inside my rear end when I take the filler plug off. Now that the filler plug is out, it's time to fill up the differential with gear lube. So make sure that the edges are all cleaned off so you're not knocking any grime or grunge inside of your differential. I'm using Valvoline 80W90 gear oil. It's a performance gear oil, and it's designed for the 8.8 rear end. So you will fill the gear oil up until it's just barely underneath that fill level cap. And then you will reinstall the fill plug and tighten it up with that 3/8 square drive ratchet. And here again, I'm just cleaning off all of the oil that I might have spilled. And it's really important that you do that because it's really the best way of telling whether you have a leak afterwards. After you've driven around for a while, you'll see buildup of dust and oil if you have a leak. Now, the last thing we need to do to finish this project is to reinstall the rear drive shaft. And as you can see, I'm putting the rear drive shaft on that differential flange that we just finished putting the seal in. You will use a 10 millimeter 12-point socket to tighten these up, and you will need to torque them to 20 to 28 foot-pounds of torque, and that will keep that drive shaft from spinning off. Next, you'll see me installing the front of the drive shaft, and that will also use the same torque specs. So you can tell that the drive shaft is nice and bright and shiny and new looking. That's because I just rebuilt that drive shaft. So you'll have to join in later to see the video on me rebuilding this drive shaft. And on top of that, the things that I have used in this video, the parts and such, I will put links in the description below. Thank you again for joining me on how to change a rear differential flange seal and tighten up the bearings. Thank you. Goodbye.